Christianity excellence, but it's through the
did race, but they only did be racist.
God is where it is. Our civilization
are constantly being told that race is a social construct. It's not even biological.
And you think, where do you belong? Yeah, you belong in a shopping mall. You know, there's nothing to you other than that.
Well, hello there, everybody. I'm your host, Matthew Drake. Thanks for joining me on this 15th episode of World of Scarcity. So for those who were away or wondered why I wasn't doing an episode last week, well, I was doing it on the alternate channel. I was over there speaking to Mr. Christopher Cantwell about some of the stuff he's been up to. So if you're not already subscribed to my alternate channel, definitely go over there. It's Matthias Drake. So today we've got another wonderful guest, and it's the first time he's come on, although we've you may have seen the video that I illustrated of him called Right-Wing Environmentalism. I think that was around a year ago or so. So it's past time that I've invited him on, and that is of course Richard Houck. And so we're gonna jump over to our screen here. How are you doing today, Richard?
I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
I'm good. Yeah. So we I figured we should just, there's a lot that we could talk about. So you're obviously an author. If people don't follow you on Twitter, they should definitely do that. Link is in the description to follow Richard. But he's an author of a book called Liberalism Unmasked. And I believe you've also got another book in the works or soon to come out called Conservatism Unmasked.
Yeah, I'm working on the follow-up now, kind of a little, it's a look at the other side in a sense of kind of the modern political spectrum. And it's still going to be a little bit, but yeah, I definitely have that in the works.
That's great. But today, so I think the right-wing environmentalism topic did come up in your book a little bit, but for those who haven't gotten a chance to see that illustration, which if you look over my left shoulder here, you can see it's in the video there on the wall hanging there. So for those who haven't watched that video, can you kind of give us a rundown, because it's a little confusing to people perhaps when they hear right-wing and environmentalism used together. So what's this all about?
So, yeah, it is definitely a little confusing, especially in the kind of, if you just follow the modern mainstream political discourse, because you don't really see so much of what people consider to be the right, kind of the conservative movement, the GOP establishment, your neoconservative types, or your civic nationalist Charlie Kirk types. None of these people really talk about the environment whatsoever, and if they do, it's often in a reactionary way to the left. You know, it's making fun of the Green New Deal, or making fun of Al Gore, and making fun of Ocasio-Cortez. And not that they don't kind of welcome and deserve some of this derision and criticism. It's that their whole position is that if the left cares about the environment, we should just do the opposite of what the left says. It's a very reactionary sort of take on it. But really, if you get into the theory and philosophy of right-wing thought versus left-wing thought, and if you look at the origins of the environmentalism movement, you see it's really almost entirely a right-wing phenomenon. And to the extent that it's a left-wing project is much later. You see some left concern about environmentalism come about in the 70s, and some left-wing Congress people did help get were instrumental in things, some of the animal rights laws we have in different states, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. But this, like I said, is in the 70s, and you had people way, way earlier than that, the turn of the century, in the early 1900s. There's many of them. There's, you have characters from, in the U.S., John Muir, Teddy Roosevelt, Madison Grant, that were all naturalists and environmentalists that had really, by any kind of modern political compass very right-leaning views. You had Richard Walter Derry in Germany, you had Savitch Devi, you have Jordan Jenks, the English guy who was a part of the British Union of Fascists. All these very hyper right-wing movements always had a kind of a green movement within it. And it's so, you have these origins of the earliest acts of conservationism in the US and in Germany were put in by people who were either outright fascist or would be considered fascist today. When you see somebody like Teddy Roosevelt and some of these people's views on race. Robertson Jefferson is another one who was a poet, an American poet that's kind of been memory hold due to his fascist leanings, who was very concerned with the environment and naturalism. And also you have, getting back kind of to the theory of it, when I say it's very much a right-wing movement, there's this, I guess, overwhelming refutation of leftism within the wild nature. And it's the main founding myth of leftism is this idea in equality, that there is equality or that we should try to achieve equality. And that's completely devoid in nature. Everything operates in a strict hierarchy. There's no sort of affirmative action or movement towards equality anywhere in nature. And it is, as far as that's concerned, that's where you see a lot of the big theoretical disconnect of what the left believes and where environmentalism fits into this. If you believe race is a social construct and that intelligence is a product of nurture, not nature, these things are completely in diametric opposition to the natural environment. There's no equality in nature. Nature itself is an absolute pillar of genetic determinism, and the idea that it is biology and genetics and nature, not any sort of nurture or environment being like your surroundings, that kind of give way to outcomes in life. So that's sort of a little bit of the history and theory behind the idea of right-wing environmentalism.
Yeah, and it I suppose makes sense that it wouldn't be a major force in our society today because we don't have, despite what the left says, we don't have any right-wing fascist governments out there. So it's kind of fallen to the wayside, if you will. And so a lot of these early writers like Grant and Muir, they've just been forgotten about. And now the best that you can get pretty much out there is conservatives, or usually it's libertarians, saying, well, I do like the environment. I want there to be free market solutions to preserving the environment and so on, which I can kind of sympathize with, but some of those things are going to be harder to achieve than others, especially in this global world where we have all these governments. So, yeah, well, this topic is, it is evergreen, to use a pun. So, but at the same time, we've also had a series of articles coming out recently, which we want to get into. And I wanted to mention, did you see this stuff happening with Greenpeace and the former co-founder of Greenpeace, Patrick Moore, was saying, I think he called AOC a pompous little twit.
I did see that.
And then, of course, after Trump's tweet about him, people were up in arms. Oh, Trump's a liar. He's not really a co-founder of Greenpeace. And so you've got this guy out there who's saying all these things that, like, oh, it's just weather, which, again, I'm not necessarily going to weigh in on that decision. I'm not like a climate scientist, but I also don't think that there's only one side to the argument. Like a lot of people on the left say, oh, there's a 98% consensus on science among scientists that global warming is happening and it's man-made, and here's all the problems and of course they use all these models and so on, and I think that I'm starting to come to the conclusion that I just don't care too much about getting to the truth of that issue if we can use it to our goals politically. And so maybe that's a good segue into this article that I sent you, because I found it to be a really interesting piece. It's in the Intelligencer, and the title, Far-Right Climate Denial is Scary, Far-Right Climate Acceptance. Uh-oh. Did I freeze up? Hold on a second.
Okay.
Oh, now we're back. Okay. Can the chat tell me, is it really slow for you guys too? I might just stop my screen share, and that might help the bandwidth. Okay, I think that'll help. So yeah, I found this to be a pretty interesting article because this author, Eric Levitz, he is obviously a liberal, but he's telling liberals basically that they have to be careful about pushing this climate change narrative because it could get adopted by the right. So he says,
yeah, I think this is this is one of those great articles where you see the mask slip a bit and a little bit of kind of real politics coming through, and they, Eric Levitz kind of starts out and talks about how some people, they don't really, the liberals like to believe that the right doesn't believe at all in climate change and has no concern with it. But then he gets to this idea that, like, he of course quotes Hitler briefly to talk about how there is this idea of kind of what happened, the horrors of a right-wing environmentalism, and he gets into the idea of Lebensraum and that sort of thing. But more, and he also quotes this kind of tongue-in-cheek tweet by Ben Shapiro about bombing India and China's coal facilities because of all the pollution they do. And the interesting thing I found about this, I think my favorite thing, is that he was saying that if the left continues to push this narrative of we need mass migration because of climate change, and we're going to have this population explosion in Africa and the third world, it's going to fuel millions and millions of migrants to Europe and the US from the global south to the first world, that at some point the clever populist and clever right wing is going to say, well, okay, if that's true, then we need to combat climate change, and we'll do it our way, not your way. And this, he didn't get into he didn't get into Linkola or like Ted Kaczynski or anything like that. But that is sort of where he's alluding to, where this leads. If you say, okay, overpopulation is a problem and it's going to threaten life as we know it. Then you have somebody like Glenn Cola, who, I forget the exact quote, but he basically said if he could hit a button and kill off most of humanity, including himself, he would gladly do it. And so you get into these very anti-human-centered ideas, and these are scary to the left.
Yes, he says, let me just read. For now, much of the global far right does not believe in the dire effects of climate change, but there's reason to think that those effects are already making people believe in the far right. Some scholars argue that climate played a pivotal role in triggering the Syrian civil war, and thus much of the migrant crisis that fueled the resurgence of right-wing nationalism in much of Europe. Even if that thesis is wrong, there's no question that climate change will condemn far more people to statelessness than events in Syria have. It's hard to imagine how the climate migrants' losses could become the nationalist right's gain.
Yeah, and then he goes on to talk about how if there's all sorts of articles about how climate change and so-called climate refugees will be the nexus for waves and waves of mass migration, like a sort of exodus that has never before seen in human history. And what I think that Levitz is getting at, and what some of the left that's a little bit more in tune with the further right, like he seems to be, is that people like us, well, I'm not sure exactly how far right you are on climate change, but definitely like me will accept it and believe in it and take some of these things at face value, although not necessarily all the like you talked about, like the 98% figure that was kind of discredited by a George Mason University study. But the idea that whether or not climate change itself is real, there is a real problem happening with overpopulation, and different populations they're already exceeding their own ability to produce food. Much of Africa in the third world, they exist and don't starve to death because of Western aid. So they're already exceeding their own civilization and own farming capacity. They are on track to exceed the carrying capacity of the land, of arable land in their nation, period. You see places like Haiti, within the Haitian territory, 99% of all of their foliage has been deforested. They've killed off tons of animals, killed off, like I said, 99% of their foliage, and forestation. It's absolutely devastating what they're doing to their natural environment. And you see this happening more and more and more. And you see all kinds of animals being poached in and around China, and places that Chinese are like starting to colonize, for basically aphrodisiacs and for expensive soups. Killing off rhinos and tigers, and there's a few thousand the whole species left. They're killing them and they're putting in these like sort of Eastern medicine Viagra pills, and so you have people that are more right-wing eco-fascist types, and when you make this law, you get this idea, at least I have this idea that there's like 1 billion Chinese and a few thousand tigers, and which one are you really interested in saving? Are you willing to sacrifice one for the other? I am. And this is kind of an affront to left-wing values. It's an affront to the idea of human rights. This idea that we have that if it's between the rhinos and the Chinese, or the giraffes and, the Africans, what if we choose the giraffes and the Africans? That's a kind of right-wing environment, or we choose the giraffes and the rhinos over the Chinese and Africans. That's a kind of right-wing environmentalism that scares these people. But I think it's the rate that it's going, because, again, whether or not you believe in global warming is really immaterial at this point, because pollution is absolutely a problem. Plastic in the ocean is absolutely a problem. I think by 2050 is the projected time. There will be more pounds of plastic in the ocean than pounds of fish in the ocean, which is just absolutely crazy. There was a study done on sea turtles. They found basically 100% of the sea turtles that they studied had plastics in their stomach and intestines. It's just absolutely crazy what's happening. And this is totally disconnected from whether or not global warming is real. If man-made global warming rather is not real, the plastic is still real. All the pollution is still real. All the endangered species being poached for the ivory trade and for aphrodisiacs and for food is still real. And population explosion in the third world leading to mass migration is still real. So we have these very, very serious issues that are entirely disconnected from whether or not man-made climate change is real. And I think that's a great place for the right to talk about and to kind of stake out some ground in the environmental movement. It doesn't have to be hedged on whether or not Al Gore's thesis come to fruition. It's entirely independent, and it's very in line with our ideas that some things are worth saving and worth protecting, and that we're an integral part of the natural environment, and that somebody has to step up and protect the environment.
And I think part of why I like this approach is that it can appeal to people on the left and the right. People on the left, we know they care about the environment, or at least they say they do. I think there's a certain number of leftists who genuinely do.
Yeah, some genuinely do. I agree.
Yes, and they've believed all of this hype about how we're destroying the world, but the problem is they're being lied to about who is doing it. We'll get into another article that's where they basically say that in the U.S. white people are dumping their pollution onto blacks, and so you get some of these stories but
I just read that one.
Oh, you did? Yeah.
Yep.
It's pretty good. But so we can appeal to these people because they genuinely want to help the environment, and if you want to do that, you have to look at Asia. You have to address this issue. So
I don't even think some of the left-leaning environmentalists, especially if that's like their one issue, some of them I've talked to, and they've said things, we've had conversations, and they've said things like that they believe in the death penalty for animal abuse and just other sort of kind of hard right, not egalitarian. It's not seeped in egalitarianism. It's seeped in almost like a hard authoritarian eco-fascism, like killing people wholesale for kicking a puppy is kind of their position. But they see the only people caring about animal rights contemporarily in the mainstream is the left. And it's a very neutered sort of environmental movement. It's not, PETA isn't advocating for really harsh abuse. And they sort of, these people, I don't even see people really paying lip service to factory farms very much anymore. And you see, again, I've talked to some leftists, and they want to shut down factory farms and have it back to a more sustainable family farming thing. And all of this it's detached from leftism more broadly, but they see it, the only place that's talking about it is kind of the left. And I think those people, especially, not the leftists that just pay lip service to it, the ones who their issue, they're more concerned with animals, environment than people. Those sort of people, I think, are very genuine and very sincere, and they could be won over by a proper environmentalist movement that, like I said, that has, appeals to these issues that are not just climate change, and they all matter. Whether if man-made climate change is real, stopping mass overpollution of our cities and air and water, and being concerned with population and carrying capacity, that'll help. If you're worried about carbon emissions, just because of the pollution they cause, that'll then, of course, help man-made climate change if it's real. So I think that a properly constructed and defined environmentalist movement will scrape off a lot of those people who think they're lefties, but they might really not be, based on kind of the things they honestly believe.
Yeah, kind of the same way that we got Bernie Bros to come to our side, I think.
Yeah,
that can occur here.
I think it's the same. You might have, like the Occupy movement, 99%. I kind of think it's similar to that. You have these people who are genuinely upset with a sort of this neoliberal / global capitalism / finance banker hegemony, and they sort of say they're left because they're for the people, but they're really, a lot of the talking points they have are kind of these classic right wing. When you think about the people who fought central banking, you have like Andrew Jackson, Adolf Hitler, Colonel Gaddafi. These weren't like liberal egalitarians exactly, And,
oh no.
But they kind of have this weird position where they think they're left, but I don't know that they are.
You have to have more of a backbone than most conservatives or liberals to go after central banking.
Yeah, and that's this weird problem with that is a weird kind of mix of some of these people on the left, where with the environmentalists or the bankers, they see it as a left position, and I don't know that it really truly is. And I don't think the solutions they want are going to be had by a leftist solution, especially environmentalism. Like the environmental, like I've seen some of these like democratic socialist and I forget the name of it, but there's like a socialist group that's like an eco-socialist, kind of like an answer to eco-fascism. And I find it very paradoxical and odd, because these are people who, communist countries were never like these bastions of environmentalism, and it was always steeped in this materialism. And it's not that they wanted to deindustrialize, they just wanted the industrialization to be under their control. And then once they got it under control, they polluted as much as any of the so-called bourgeoisie or capitalist class would have. And it's not an effective solution to any of their problems. It kind of seems like it is at first, but when you really get into it and look at the history of it, whether it was the Tsars in control or the kulaks or the Bolsheviks, the Bolsheviks didn't like pollute any less, and they weren't interested in that. It was all about kind of the materialism that they claimed to fight.
So I've got this article which you sent me from ecowatch.com of the 100. Well, it gives a list of the 100 most polluted cities, and in the top 30, I think it is something like 22 are in India, 5 are in China, 2 are in Pakistan, and then here's this picture. Greenpeace put out this triplet shot of very hazy skies in Seoul, New Delhi, and Bangkok. And but what do they say? They say air pollution is making the major cities of the world uninhabitable. Just like, oh, this is sort of happening, because they can't criticize people in these countries, right? They're just saying, oh, this is air pollution, as if almost as if the implication is this too is white people's fault somehow. That's just insane. I guess it's all of the cheap stuff that we've been ordering, huh? That's what's causing it. No, but I've seen on Twitter, like, you'll see these villages in India or something, and it's just trash flowing in a river. The whole river is filled with trash. And you're just looking at this like, how do you live like this? But everybody's smiling. Nobody seems to care. So this, the common rebuttal to this sometimes when you bring it up to people on the right is they'll say, well, this is the natural process that people have to go through in industrialization. So I guess my question to you is, can we compare apples and oranges when we're looking at these, these Asian, these other countries, non-white countries? Can we compare that to sort of the period when we were going through industrialization, or is there a reason that that's not a fair comparison or something? And also, do you think that those people, after industrialization takes place, that this will improve or something?
Yeah, it is true that in at least in the United States and England during the Industrial Revolutions, the places were dirty, and there was a lot of stuff being dumped into rivers. The rivers in Ohio, I know because I'm from Ohio, there was rivers catching on fire because there was so much oil and trash being dumped in them. There was all kinds of pollution. There was, logging of old growth forest. There was animals being hunted to extinction and near extinction. There was, a lot of these dirty hovel kind of ghettos in England and in the U.S. So it is true, we did have the Industrial Revolution growing pains where we had a lot of pollution and a lot of trash and all of that. And I don't know that it's entirely the same in the sense that these, like India and China, their Industrial Revolution was sort of a product of them getting a lot of this technology and things from like the U.S. and from England, and of factories being built there from like Western companies building factories overseas. And I don't know if they are going to naturally, I don't know if there's any like Indian and Chinese naturalist, like their equivalent of a John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt and Madison Grant, to really start to push for a cleanup effort. And it's so far gone. Like I don't think it is apples to apples in the sense that, you see those stats about the amount of pollution being put in the air, about the tons of carbon, about the tons and tons of plastics in the ocean. The U.S. Industrial Revolution didn't put billions of pounds of plastic in the ocean, and didn't put, probably the whole of the Industrial Revolution in the U.S. and through Europe probably didn't put the amount of carbon and pollutants in the air that China and India do in every passing year. So I think the scale of it is something that is kind of unprecedented. And like I said, I don't see that they are moving towards any sort of naturalist movement or really any legislative or political or kind of social solution. So I'm very skeptical of the idea that it's a natural process that they will somehow become like enlightened environmentalists. And you don't even have that in the West, even though we do have better environmental laws than we used to, speaking in the West more broadly, and compared to the rest of the world, including the advanced countries in Eastern Asia, we have, in many cases, better protections and for the environment and for animals. But I'm just not seeing it. I think it's something that's going to need to be almost like forced upon them. Need to be some sort of action taken collectively against some of these polluters. I saw a couple articles recently about China, about how much smog and pollution is making its way from China over to Korea and Japan, and they're like, they're mad about it. All this stuff coming from Hong Kong and different places over, bringing these clouds of smog over Japan to where they get these air quality warnings, and I don't see it slowing down, especially with the continued you're starting to see some like Chinese colonization in Africa. It looks like it's just going to get worse.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think it will get worse.
There's
I
a
just wanted to
interesting.
mention.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, on this list of 100, you have to go down to, I think 92 was the first European country or city that I saw. The rest are all in Asia. So, and also, I wish I could find it. There was this map that showed how the Indian Ocean was basically the toilet bowl of the world. And so fecal matter is rampant in India. And that's why you've partially got so many problems with disease, is they don't have proper toilets, and they don't flush, and they wipe with their hands and all that stuff.
That's another good point. There was I just saw a little video about sewage runoff coming from Mexico into some like border towns in the southern U.S. And that's a really good point as to kind of support the idea I have that I don't think these people are going to naturally have a sort of green or environmental movement or curb any of their pollution from industrial society. Is that in the Europe and US, there was already kind of movements towards more sanitary conditions, and in various industries, whether it was the meat industry or better factory conditions for workers, or whether it was constantly improving our water and plumbing infrastructure. And you see this in ancient Europe, these kind of attempts at sanitation, and pretty successful ones. And you still don't have even that much. You don't even have a really proper infrastructure for sanitation in India and in many places in China. So with them lagging behind so generally, I just don't see them getting to the point of where, and there's no benefit to them to deindustrialize or to stop polluting. They don't really have any reason to at this point.
Well, there's no benefit to us either, other than some I guess innate altruism or something.
Yeah, I think I guess if you look
preserving
at
the beauty of the natural world, we like to see beautiful things.
Yeah, I think you have that intrinsic value, and I think there's certain populations that are I think that's almost intrinsically a white thing. Mm-hmm. There was a bunch of articles, and like Mother Jones says the green movement is lily white, why that's a problem. From Huffington Post, environmental groups are too white. Another one, professor criticizes green movement for being too white. The unsustainable whiteness of the green movement. Why is the green movement so white? How to make environment movement more green and less white. How green movements became so white and what to do about it, from Yale. Michigan professor says the green movement is too white. You see this time and time again. Anytime I see environmental movements or people working towards environmentalism or animal rights, I always noticed it was very white, and I kind of started looking into it again. And then I found dozens of articles, kind of saying this is a bad thing, that it's too white. So I think the idea that, I guess when I say they don't have a reason to do it, I think I don't even see it in kind of as a people. Realistically, it seems to be concerned with the environment, which, however you want to take that, the left sees that as kind of a bad thing, and that almost like an exclusionary, like white club, whereas I see it as more of a white value that a lot of other races and civilizations and ethnicities don't possess. So, you can look at it however you want, but there's sufficient data of the fact that the environmental movement is a white movement.
Yeah.
So
it reminds
kind
me,
of do what you want with that.
It sort of reminds me of like Jordan Peterson's audience, the people who are really into individualism. It's white people,
Yeah.
Of course. And of course, there's also the people out there maybe the fellow whites, etc., who want to use this because they know that it's an issue that whites care about, so they want to use it to extract money or something, or pass more regulations. Also stopping them from having kids. That's something we haven't mentioned. How many times do you see these articles that are saying, stop having kids because the climate is warming and we have too many people on this earth, so we can't handle it all. The carbon footprint is out of control. Meanwhile, what do they show? They show a picture of white babies, and only white babies. So a lot of people are pointing out this is the only time you'll ever see a picture of just white babies on an article like this without diversity. It's because they're saying stop having these kids. So
that's very true. And these articles are all pushed at, I mean, like I said, so the caring about the environment is kind of an inherently a white thing. So when they push these environment articles, these are going to white people. No person in the Congo is going to read that and say, oh, I better not have my country average of 7 to 9 kids. I better just have one because the carbon footprint to begin with. So these are very much articles published in places like Mother Jones and whatnot that probably has a readership that is as white, if not more white, than something like the Daily Stormer or National Vanguard. Same thing with, you say about the Jordan Peterson. I have a couple of friends that are libertarian, and anytime they say anything about racism, I always joke with them that their libertarian meetups are as white as a Klan rally. And what are they talking about? Like my racism or whatever. They're a part of these groups that are explicitly white or implicitly white. But yeah, you see the same thing with all these articles about caring for the environment. It tugs on the kind of white heartstring for the environment and then tells them to not have kids while there's population explosions going on all over the third world that are entirely funded by white tax dollars and white farmers' ability to produce food. And then we're even having our wildlands like infringed upon. The factory farms continue to grow in the U.S. The Wildlife Services, which is like a subdepartment of the Department of Agriculture, kills millions and millions of animals every year. They kill bears, foxes, coyotes, all kinds of things in clearing land for more farms. And the only reason that has to happen to our land in the U.S. and to our wildlife is because we're letting in over 1 million people a year and then trying to feed, millions of people. It's very, so I guess the inherent value of environmental movement for white people is, I think this is a kind of a right-wing, this is another right-wing thing that like you view yourself as like part of nature, part of the broader ecosphere. And we're not, like, man isn't disconnected, something separate from nature. It's something that's a part of nature and has to operate within the laws of nature. And as we hurt the environment, we kind of hurt ourselves. And that's also a very right-wing, very like white person view of things. Whereas others, like you said, whether it's the fellow whites or the Chinese, it's all about how much money they can make off this, and how many more trinkets they can buy. And or there's other groups of population that just care about how many chicken wings and sneakers they can buy, and they don't have any concern. I don't see any like black environmental groups or people concerned with this kind of thing. And it's getting to the point where there was an article I read, and it basically said the plastics in the ocean is starting to spread disease like never before. And there were some interesting things happening. There were like these animals that carry different sort of sea creatures and crabs and crustaceans and different things that were like living on these rafts of plastic in the ocean and carrying diseases and parasites from one part of the planet to the other by like surviving on these little islands of plastic trash. And then you have, like I mentioned, that already from all the pollution from China is making its way into Japan and Korea. You have the same thing going on in India. and this is it's creating a global public nuisance. So you have, it's not just now, India's polluting India or China is polluting China. They're now starting to pollute the whole world. That's a problem I've been kind of working on, and I'm working on this concept, this legal concept called the global public nuisance doctrine. And public nuisance is like it's an old common law concept, and it's the idea a public nuisance is an unreasonable interference with the right common to the general public. And there's some things where the places where people create a public nuisance is where any conduct that unreasonably interferes with the public health, safety, and welfare can constitute a public nuisance. And this is what's happening on a global scale. It's not just this is a doctrine that would be, to give you an example, let's say a oil refinery or a concrete factory moved into your neighborhood, and there was all kinds of smog and concrete dust or all kinds of fumes from the oil that made it so you couldn't enjoy outside. You couldn't go outside in your own lawn because you would like choke on all the concrete dust or whatever. That would be a form of a property nuisance, right? Where somebody else's use of their property is now interfering with yours. Well, that's now starting to happen on a global scale due to pollution, whether it's air pollution or pollution in the oceans. And this property right, where you can essentially enjoin somebody else from polluting their own land because it spills over onto your land, I think we can use in some sort of national treaty or as a kind of cause for action to get a control of some of these countries that are essentially destroying every ecosystem that they come in contact with.
Well, yeah, so what was I going to say? Yeah, so you mentioned the oceans. It's spreading through the oceans, and we all have to live on this planet. So at what point is all of this going to come over to our countries? Also, by that time, will it be too late? I mean, that's sort of what I fear is, like, who knows where we'll be in 20 years. Already the United States is heading towards a position where it's not a global superpower. So they, will we even be able to police these people? I guess that's sort of another question. It all depends on what comes next. I think a lot of people have a feeling that, this American experiment of liberal democracy, it's not really, it's not going so well. And so it's just kind of a question of when. But I think, bringing these points to bear on people, it forces them to confront a very stark reality, which is that these people in these other countries, whether it's race, culture, what have you, it is they are the biggest perpetrators, and yet nobody's saying, oh, we need to curb their population growth. Actually, I think technically that's not true. Macron said one time that African population growth was out of control or something, and I don't think he ever brought it up again because
you probably got a talking to for saying that.
Yeah, I mean, you're not supposed to go there. Then you have to start talking about what do you do about these things. But of course, we don't have to advocate for genocide or anything, right? It's just we can decide to make policies that favor our country, and and these other places we can put sanctions, tariffs, all the things that they want to do to Russia, just basically because they don't like Russia, and they think they have all these conspiracies about them interfering when in reality it's just because they're allies with Iran and stuff. But so
Yeah,
like,
that's
why can't
a
this
really,
be a part of our foreign
really great
policy?
point. Yeah, that's a really great point about the sanctions, and even kind of separate from my idea of the global public nuisance doctrine. If we can sanction Russia and not buy, not import anything from Russia, then we can say to China and India, you're the biggest polluters, and we buy X amount of stuff from you. I don't know how much we buy from them and how much. I mean, if you look at the amount of air pollution globally, well, I should say in the U.S. at least, it's mostly from transportation and energy production, and I don't know how much of that is like in China, India factories and different like manufacturing. It could be larger since there's many factories there, but the idea would be about the same. If we can sanction Russia because of election hacking or whatever fictitious thing they made up, we could sanction India and China all the same in efforts to curb the pollution. If in public nuisance doctrine, if you have somebody that puts, like I said, a concrete plant or oil refinery next to you, and you get a court order, if you go to court and show that they are creating a nuisance to your property, you can basically have the courts shut them down. If they keep operating and keep polluting you, at some point you could end up sending the sheriffs out and just locking up the factory. And similarly, I think like Korea and Japan they could operate, they could put this global public nuisance doctrine in operation and say that if China doesn't stop doing this, they will take some sort of action and be serious about it. That's a good point that you made about whether the America will continue to exist as a superpower or not with the ability to police these places. As it stands right now, I mean, we have a military budget of $600 billion a year. We've spent trillions of dollars in the last 17 years doing all of Israel's dirty work in the Middle East. If all that money, was spent on a global cleanup, if the entire military was kind of restructured and mobilized of global cleanup, I think a lot of good could be done. And there's also some other interesting things that don't involve any sort of imperialistic military actions. There's a guy his name is David Millark, and there's a little documentary about him. I think it's only 10, 11 minutes long. It's called Moving the Giants. And just to give you a brief rundown of what this guy's doing, that is another place that the U.S. should be. I just saw that there was like $100 million that authorized for Ivanka Trump to help spread feminism around the world, which is pretty much textually unconstitutional, because if you look in the Constitution, the idea of what Congress can authorize money for, it's for the welfare of the United States. It specifically says United States, so that things like $100 million for feminism in Iraq wouldn't get spent. But this is just an idea of how, like, if you had a right-wing eco-fascist government, the $100 million would not go to feminism 6,000 miles away. It would go to this guy, David Millark.
Just to interrupt you, maybe they
Sure.
think that because we're going to invite all these people here anyway, they might as well be the United States.
Yeah, that's another thing. I saw an unironic quote from some leftist, and it was like, well, actually, it might have been a boomer. I don't even know what the difference is anymore. All boomers are pretty much leftist. But it was like, if we can't spread freedom to everywhere in the world, we can bring them here to the freedom. And I'm like,
oh my gosh,
that's just crazy.
Bring the horse to the water or something like that, right? Oh,
yeah,
geez.
it was just crazy. So what this guy's doing is he's working on cloning giant sequoias, redwoods. And the redwood trees is the best, a best sequester on the planet of any living thing. And one redwood can take in like 1,000 pounds of carbon. And there was a study done and it found that in a 2.5 acre area, that they studied, these redwoods, stored 2,600 metric tons of carbon in 2.5 acres. And the U.S. produces about 5 billion metric tons of carbon per year. So just to kind of give you where I'm going with this, if you had 1,000 of those 2.5 acre sections of redwoods, that would take out half of the carbon produced by the U.S. every year. If you had 2,000 of these 2.5 acre sections, which isn't, huge amount of land, you would basically be at a net zero on carbon emissions. So for all the carbon that we produce through transportation and energy production, it would all be taken out of the air by these giant sequoia trees. So you have this guy trying to clone them and get them to live in places that's not just on the coast right now. So if you take this idea and kind of think it through with just a little bit of imagination, we could potentially create a country that is at a net zero on carbon. So for every bit of carbon that we produce through transportation and energy production, even using fossil fuels like we do now, could be taken right out of the air by these giant sequoias that we produce. By produce, I mean plant and foster and help grow and help survive, right? So we could have like a really, really cool, progressive country in terms of managing our carbon. And it would be the prototype. It would be like the gold standard, the beacon on the hill or whatever for every other country, of this idea of environmental management counteracting industrial society. So even if you don't want to go full Ted Kaczynski and destroy industrial society, there are kind of clever ways to kind of work this out, but it can't be done while you're spending $100 million on feminism in Iraq, and it can't be done when you have over 1 million brown people coming into your country every year. And instead of planting more trees and rewilding areas, you have to bulldoze more areas to get more factory farms because they all eat a bunch of meat. And then you're going the other way. Now you have a bunch of factory farms producing insane amounts of methane, and then they basically pollute the rivers. If you ever look into any, like where all the factory farm runoff, they produce just tons and tons and tons of, manure from the animals. And a lot of that just gets run off into creeks and then into rivers. So we're kind of going the other way right now, but it could be done. You could do sanctions like you talked about. We could do our rewilding with the redwoods. You could work on reducing carbon emissions anyway. So as you plant more trees, we're at 5 billion metric tons right now of carbon producing each year. We could try to lower that, plant more trees, plant more redwoods specifically to take as much carbon we can out of the air. At some point we'll have a bunch of redwoods, little carbon. It would be great. You need to stop giving aid to the third world. And like you said, you don't have to, there's no need to have a genocidal plan. Most of these people are entirely unsustainable on their own. They spend more time having kids than they do farming. And you basically have to cut off aid. You have to criminalize things like what Bill Gates is doing, giving these people billions of dollars in food and medicine. And Bill Gates, if you look at his Twitter, he talks about how the African youth is going to be like the driving force of the U.S. economy, and how he wants all these African youths to come here, and how he's helping extend the average age of Africa and extend their lives and livelihood and all these things. And he should just be jailed as an anti-white terrorist, or like some sort of anti-environmental terrorist in these sort of schemes.
Well, yeah, I do want to point out there's a difference between, like genocide and just discouraging breeding or stopping the encouragement of breeding, which is what we're doing now. And
right,
maybe that's lost on some people, but
yeah, if you just totally cut the aid, it'll take care of itself.
I mean, basically, when they conflate those two things, they are admitting that they are completely dependent on us. Like,
Right. Right, and they are.
And they are. And that's, it's something that people want to view a certain group or something as being unconnected from the rest of the world. And this kind of goes back to the ocean thing, how I had this idea for a drawing where you would overlay a map of the atlas with a body, and you kind of have like the United States is the head, like Europe is the heart, maybe there's like a stomach or something in Russia, that area, the butthole or whatever is coming out of the Indian Ocean, as we can tell, and then maybe your legs are in Africa or something like that. But it is kind of this, when you start thinking about it as an organism in itself, like the human population as an organism, because all these people, they want to say, we're in this together, right? But we're learning that they're not really genuine about that, because in order for people to work together, you have to understand that we're not all equal, right? We're not just cogs in a machine. We're not just replaceable. So if you start swapping out organs in your body, that is going to, you're going to destroy yourself. And if you have a cancer that's spreading into your heart and brain, well, guess what? The body's going to die. And that is the problem. That's this, I guess, Malthusian problem or something, this overpopulation problem that seems to be lurking, and only the right-wing environmentalists seem to recognize that it's coming.
Yeah, that's a really great point. They do pretend we're all in this together, but then when it comes to blame for pollution, they say it's all white people. When it comes to overpopulation, they say it's all white people, when these things are just just patently untrue. Even if you look at all the data we have is from the government and Eco-Watch and these kind of places. It's not like they have a reason to lie to us and say China's polluting twice as much as the US. It's just and they don't really, it's one of those things that the left does. They don't really believe that we're all in it together. They kind of want to pretend we're all equal, but they're not. And just, going back to the race thing, that guy who's spending his life work at trying to clone redwoods and get them to survive in places that aren't just on the coast is a white guy. Everybody involved in this kind of stuff that cares, they're right wing. Well, he might not be right wing. He might just be one of the people that care about the environment. But even that, like I said, that's recognizing for the environment and the wild nature for what it is kind of an inherently right wing thing, because it rejects equality and rejects tolerance and all these founding myths, and it rejects the idea that we're all the same in absolute terms. I mean, just in the most ferocious and absolute terms.
Well, I don't think, Rich, we're going, barring some kind of absolute catastrophe, there's no going back. We're not de-industrializing, right? So we need to think about how, like, what is the best way to get out of the problems that are facing the globe? Because I'm willing to admit, sure, there are problems. I think global warming isn't as big a problem as they make it out to be relative to some of these other problems. But setting that aside, it's you got to think what's the solution, and like you said, technology, innovations. This guy trying to figure out how to clone something. I was researching a little bit about. I don't have it pulled up, but it's just some of the groundbreaking inventions that have come out, and there's some guy who's trying to create an engine which will be carbon neutral or something, and I think it might be a fusion reactor or something like that. But there's advancements that are being made, and across the list of the research that I found, there was maybe one person who was non-white. So, like this, they're all old white guys, okay? And they've got the money and the patience, the intelligence to make this these dreams a reality. And so I always say, betting on technology in the long term is a good bet, and anything that we can do to help our people prosper, it is going to help the whole world. But yeah, giving aid to these people and taking the tax dollars from white people, giving it to these other groups, it's not going to help. But here, can we jump over to that USA Today article that we were talking about?
Yeah.
While we're on the race issue. So they say
unequal air pollution from whites disproportionately affects blacks and Hispanics.
Yes, that is the one.
Yep. And opening line: the air that Americans breathe is not equal.
I cannot believe how stupid this is.
Study too much.
Like,
did you get into this study? They cited too much.
I didn't really look at the study. No. Well, okay,
I looked at it.
The only thing I didn't look at the study, but I read what they said, and even based on what they said, it just doesn't make any sense, because they are looking at basically. Let me scroll down here. They're looking at how much you consume. That's basically what it is. So if you consume more, and you buy more stuff, which needs carbon to create stuff, then you are polluting the atmosphere. I almost don't feel like it's worth taking this apart, but their basic premise is that whites, have a net drain on the system, meaning that they put more carbon into the environment than they are exposed to, whereas Hispanics and blacks, it's the reverse. They, for blacks, it's 56% gap there, and for Hispanics, it's 63%. Isn't this basically just wealth? I mean, it's basically just, it's a measure of how wealthy are they, right?
This is partially a matter of that. This whole thing is insane. One of the first things I noticed is when I was reading some of this acute data, like you said, the blacks are exposed to 50% more pollution than is caused by their consumption. And I read that line, and the first thing I thought is like, wow, now all of a sudden you guys understand per capita and statistics. Like, okay, that's convenient. You play stupid for years and years and years and years when it comes to FBI data and criminal justice data. But now all of a sudden you guys are statisticians. Okay. There's this line. This whole thing is should be, I guess, seen for what it is. It's anti-white propaganda. This professor of Texas Southern University, public affairs, Robert Ballard, who's a black guy, says, whites are dumping the pollution on poor people and poor people of color. These findings confirmed what most grassroots environmental justice leaders have known for decades. So, and when you read that, it's just crazy. It's as if this suburban white family is like getting in their minivan and driving down to the ghetto and throwing a box of pollution out into the projects. Right. The way they talk about this stuff. And this is also very interesting how this black guy and these people talk about pollution in this very like concrete thing. Like they are dumping their pollution on poor people and people of color as if it's literally like this tangible, like I said, like it's this box of trash that they're just throwing into a black neighborhood. And it's just, their inability to understand how pollution works is kind of fascinating. If you look at the most polluted cities in the US, 8 of 10 of them are in California, and they're in these very like brown cities that are just packed with people, like LA and surrounding areas. And this article doesn't, this is this doesn't talk about on the global scale. And the brown people are actually the ones causing the most pollution, and the brown people are the ones with their populations going crazy. And like you said, the way they do this method is about consumption. And I think there was a part in it, I was looking at the actual study reference that referenced another study where they got the consumption. Part of it was about the amount of like travel. So I guess if white people fly on airplanes more, and airplanes cause a significant amount of the transportation carbon emissions, then white people are going to be higher per capita at airplane pollution, because white people per capita have more cars and fly on airplanes more and buy more TVs.
Wait,
probably.
How does that work though? Who's getting exposed to airplane pollution?
Yeah, but what they're saying is like, so if everybody is exposed to X parts per million of pollution, right?
Yeah.
So if all Americans are exposed to X parts per pollution, and that's, let's just say that's equal, because white people are flying on planes more, causing more pollution, that the blacks are breathing in more pollution than that they actually cause by flying on airplanes. Is kind of
so. Is it therefore the case that everyone is exposed to the same amount? Because I thought that was part of it too. Like the blacks are in the cities, so they're around cars more.
Yeah, that I didn't see where they did that in the study, but I believe that was part of it. Because if you search like environmental racism, that is a topic that comes up that like they did. By they, I mean the researchers looked at zip codes by pollution, and then what the racial percentage of the zip codes were, and they then concluded that black people are and Hispanics are suffering from more environmental pollution, which is essentially a function of them being more urban dwellers.
Well, so technically, I mean theoretically, the definition of racism, who even knows what it means anymore, but it's supposed to mean like prejudice, right? So how, like, they have to assume that white people are intentionally doing this if they're doing it, right?
Yeah, one article I read some time ago about environmental racism, I mean, these people get incredibly like clever and with how they formulate these narratives. One went back to, pre-Fair Housing Act and before the Shelley versus Kramer decision, and then brought up bank redlining and FHA like programs and housing, some other housing, federal funded housing thing or something or other. And basically what they were saying, because there used to be segregation in neighborhoods and schools legally, there's this de jure segregation you could do, and blacks were clustered in urban environments, and then they couldn't afford to move out to the suburbs, and now urban environments are the most polluted. Therefore, white people, because we used to have de facto segregation, are responsible for the fact that black people are clustered in these zip codes where there's more pollution. And it's, that's a long line. It's kind of attenuated, I guess, if you want to believe it or not. But it's just like one of these things. Well, like, I guess you all could go back to China and Mexico and Africa and not breathe our polluted air. That's an option. It's always that. You can always go see how the air is in the Congo.
Do you want to hear my hot take on this?
Yeah.
My hot take is that this is karma. This is reparations, because when blacks were slaves, you see, they didn't have to go into the coal mines or whatever and get black lung. They were out in the fields and they were breathing the fresh air. So you know how people like to say, oh, this is, white replacement is karma for the Native Americans genocide and so on. Well, I guess this is just karma for when they were, they had it so good in the fields and so on. They weren't exposed to pollution back then.
They got all that fresh air, and they didn't have to. Oh, what about all the little white kids that had to work in factories, and were getting their limbs caught in the machines, and there was I saw a thing. Man, wish I could remember the specific instance. Basically, this factory owner in some textile plant padlocked the door so that the people couldn't go out and get fresh air, and like 100 and some of them died in a fire. And they were all white, of course. So yeah, that could be karma for that. And it's also interesting because the U.S., the global West, Europe, the pollution that goes on in these countries, in white countries, predominantly white countries, is so much less than what is coming from India and China and Africa. So for these blacks and Hispanics, if they think if Hispanics think air pollution is bad here, then they can like go right back to Mexico City and see how they like it there. If they think it's so, if blacks think pollution is so bad in LA, then they can go try Somalia. They can go right back to where they came from. And that's the interesting thing about this article, of how it's clear, like anti-white animus. It's that, and also there's the sophistry about, like, although the pollution is worse in the cities, it's not to the point where it's not like, being in New York City is like being in Mumbai, and being just outside of New York City is the cleanest place ever. I think all Americans it's going to be more or less the same. And like you said, they're just trying this thing, this little bit of sophistry. Well, because white people drive in cars a little bit more per capita as compared to blacks, then they're blacks are breathing in their unfair share of pollution or whatever. Yeah. You can just say it's karma for all the black crime that they commit, or it's karma for the inordinate welfare rate in the black community. Like, they get free everything, but you have to breathe a little bit worse air as a result. Because white people, a lot of that stuff, it's probably like white factories and white industry that they're blaming, that like pays all the taxes for all their gigs. So I don't really see the grievance.
Yeah, and white people tend to live out in the country where it's, you do see the difference. It's not as obvious as Mumbai, but everybody has experienced that when you, if you're just in a suburb or so on, it's oftentimes hard to see the sky, the night sky. But if you go out into the countryside, it's crystal clear. And so there is still obviously some pollution. There's some improvements we can make, obviously.
Right, but they make it sound like it was that these articles I talked about before, where Korea and Japan are getting these huge smog clouds that come from China. This article would have you believe that, like, there's this nice white suburb that's pumping out all this smog, and then like has this big fan blowing it over to the black neighborhood, and then now the black neighborhood had this big like black lung smog death cloud that the white people like sent over intentionally.
I wouldn't be surprised if there was a Simpsons episode about that, how Mr. Burns is. I know that they did a whole bit on pumping it into the rivers, and then there's these big giant mutated fish that come out.
Yeah,
just
the whole
race into there, and then you're good with your propaganda. You're good to go.
Yeah, it is a crazy propaganda piece that just stirs up anti-white animus. There's no other, like, that's the whole purpose of this.
Yeah. John Sinclair sends $2. Pollution disproportionately affects blue jays. Yeah. So the global 2% or whatever you have there. Blue jays is kind of my term for globalists with big noses.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
So, yeah, I'm sure they're dumping some pollution somewhere too.
Yeah, I'm sure. A lot of the sure, you're right. Sure, part of these it's kind of another reason, like, to reject neoliberal economic theory and global capitalism. We get all the have strict environmental controls to places that have virtually none, and then it costs a lot of money to to transport your raw material to your factory, to your assembly place, to back to where it's going to be consumed, and then back to wherever you're going to dispose of it. Has a, you know, every material to its little widget is transferred back. You have a lot of pollution happening. So that's sort of a reason to the idea of offshoring. And it all kind of comes back to a more right-wing economic would help this. On migration would stop this. A halt on foreign aid would help stop this. If you had tariffs on these places, it would also foster economic protectionism, help American jobs. Everything could be, you know, if you had a straight and actual right-wing policy across the board on everything, a lot of this could be alleviated. And an isolationist military position. If we spent that $600 billion instead of protecting Israel and causing havoc in the Middle East.
Yeah, imagine what we could be doing with that money.
And using the Coast Guard and the Navy to like go around and scoop up trash. Man, that would be, I wouldn't be so mad about getting taxed for it, I don't think.
Right.
Be more palatable.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people would feel better about their money going toward that cause. So this article, they did mention the term environmental justice, and I don't know about you, but I kind of like it. I think we could adopt.
You still there?
That. Sorry, what's that? Can you hear me? Uh-oh. We might have lost. Oh, we might have lost a connection here. Sorry, folks. We're having a connection problem.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
For some reason, I can't hear you.
Well, this is problematic. My whole computer is locking up. I'm gonna have to shut down my Google Chrome. Sorry, folks. If you can hear me, I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can hear me, really, I guess I need. Oh, I'm all alone now. Really, I need a better computer because this is just not fast enough here. This is awful. I'm sorry, guys. We've lost our guest now. I assume we're still going, but I'm gonna have to start up everything again. Oy, what a bummer. This is terrible. I can't even communicate with you guys now. Should I even keep this going? What should I talk about while I'm waiting for my incredibly slow computer to do something? Maybe I can talk about what I want to do in the future. Let's see. Well, I've been putting out more of the episodes where I'm just talking, the artist speaks type of thing. So, and that's gotten pretty good reception. Usually those are doing 4,000 views or so, which is more than my drawing videos get, my illustration videos. So I definitely want to do more of those. I don't want to stop doing illustration. But I want to do more talking. I really like, who is that guy? Vincent James of the Red Elephants. He puts out stuff like every day, it seems like. And his stuff is, usually it's shorter, you know? Yeah, so mine tend to be about a half hour long, my videos. I put out one on Andrew Yang not too long ago, and then one on the Dissenter plugin for Gab, which you can go look at. But, you know, so I'll, just for those of you who are watching, because, man, I love you guys for sticking with me. Just for those of you who are watching, I'm going to... Oh, man. Did it restart all over again? Is this an entirely different stream? Oh, okay. I see the chat now. I see the chat again. So, people can hear me. That's good. We will get it back, because the show's not over yet, folks. The show's not over. I wanted to give people a preview of what they can expect, because well, you're all still with me. So as you may know, Guillaume Fay recently passed away. So press F. And so I'm going to, I think, illustrate something from Guillaume Fay on his speech at NPI in 2015. It's titled, same thing as his book, I believe, which is Why We Will Win.
Hey, you can hear me?
There you are. Yes, I do hear you.
Sweet. All right, back. Are we back in this? We're on the right stream, right?
I assume so. I just restarted everything. I'm not entirely sure if it should be the same stream. So yeah.
All right.
Hopefully it'll maintain itself. And I think we kept the connection with the stream, but my browser crashed, and so that's why we lost you.
Okay. All right. I think we're good now. You last I heard, you said something about environmental justice.
Okay. Yes. I was saying that article, I think it was the black professor that you mentioned. I think he used the term environmental justice, and I just thought that is actually something we could appropriate, really, is sort of using this idea of justice, not in the sense that, oh, these other people owe us, but we want what is just for the entire globe. And
yeah, I like it, and I'm a big fan of like judoing left-wing talking points and theories, and like taking the underlying theory and turning it back on them. I really like that judo move there. And yeah, we are trying to get justice for the environment. You know, we're trying to avenge the blue macaw that they made extinct, and we're going to punish the capitalist pigs for polluting all of our riverways and cutting down all the sequoias. And it's justice. We're going to seek justice with the global public nuisance doctrine. We're not going to let these other people continue to devalue our property, our collective interest in our planet and our nation with their own whatever their own goals are in their country, to give infinity trinkets to infinity Africans. We're not going to let that happen anymore. It's
Yeah.
I like it.
All right. Just a couple more quick questions. We should probably wrap up relatively soon. But so a lot of people are getting caught up in the presidential race 2020. Is there and the whole Yang thing and all that.
Yang Bucks.
Yang Bucks. I don't know what his position is, but is there in general, is there anyone saying anything relatively good on environmentalism?
I read through, not really. Yeah, the Green New Deal is really terrible. I kind of did a breakdown of that on a Red Ice, I think. Whole thing's just awful, and every time they have a good point, it's like littered with social justice rhetoric nonsense about like we need equal jobs for all the brown people and blah blah blah, and the whole thing is crazy and kind of a non-starter. I don't know Yang's position on the environment. I haven't seen it. I haven't followed it too closely because I haven't been online a whole lot. Been kind of working on other stuff. But I can't imagine him being much worse than what's out there. The Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens saying they hate the environment, and then AOC saying that we need to have no borders and infinite gibs for goblina moms of 10 children.
Yeah.
I can't see it being worse than those positions.
Yang's thing is pretty much the automation. That's his big talking point.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to ask the question because even Elizabeth Warren has come out and said surprising things like, I want to bust up the tech corporations, which some on the right were like cheering that. So, it's like, it wouldn't surprise me if someone came out and said something about this huge crisis that's looming in Asia and so on. I think that could really be an issue that a lot of people could get behind. You don't necessarily have to tie it to race. We do live in a multicultural society, so I understand why people running for president aren't going to do that. Ultimately, those immigration and environmentalism, they're extremely connected, and we both know that. But
yeah, almost like inextricably so. Like some of this stuff is almost impossible to even separate and tease apart, and a lot of people want to do that, and kind of to their own peril. And you've seen it in the failures of the environmental movement, and the failures to kind of stop this just onward march of global capitalism and mass migration and everything else.
Right on. So are there any, for people who are interested in this topic, are there any books that you would recommend on it?
Savitri Devi's The Impeachment of Man is really good. Lincola's Can Life Prevail is another one. Let me think. I had a stack somewhere over here. Can Life Prevail? Joy and Jinx Spring Comes Again is an interesting one. So those three are some far-right authors that I would definitely recommend. Any of the Edward Abbey stuff I've just been recently getting into. He wrote The Monkey Wrench Gang and Desert Solitaire. He's a interesting environmental author. I would definitely, the classics are probably, Walden is definitely one of the classics of kind of the early proto-environmental movement. What is the other one? I would definitely read for fiction, Walden and Desert Solitaire, or Monkey Wrench Gang, Desert Solitaire from Edward Abbey, and Walden. Edward Abbey has an interesting quote, and it's very pertinent to this idea of like Bill Gates and his Infinity African plan and the ever increasing need, lust, whatever, for more GDP. And he said the only type of organism that seeks growth for the sake of growth is a cancer cell. And if growth is just your end goal, just more GDP for the sake of more GDP, you're just a cancer cell, and that's your function, and you should be treated as such. So yeah, I would recommend Linkola, Devi, Jordan Jenks. Oh yeah, definitely read Industrial Society and Its Future. Ted Kaczynski, he has some really great takes about leftism and environmentalism. One of the he talks about the danger of leftism in his manifesto, and how leftism, he says, leftism in the long run is inconsistent with wild nature, with human freedom, and elimination of modern technology. Even if you disagree with his total anti-industrial revolution take, I think that there's parts of it worth noting. Just to give you, kind of an example of kind of how I look at it. The toys, just children's toys, used to be made out of wood and steel and these more permanent resins, and now everything's plastic and disposable and cheap, and like it would be, there used to be this idea that maybe somebody would build a wooden toy truck for a kid, and then you wouldn't just throw it away, you would keep it and you'd pass it on to the next kid, and maybe they would pass it on to their kids. And
well, that's the case too with architecture. I mean, we used to build things out of massive stones that we wanted it to last for centuries, and now you're looking at a lifespan of maybe 40 years or so for building.
Architecture is a perfect example of this. Of you don't have to say, you don't have to. There's this. There's a nice balance, I would say, between going back to total primitive technology and living in like huts versus this planned obsolescence and hyper consumerism and materialism that we have now. So you don't have to say we don't produce anything, but let's make things that last. Let's build things that last for all time again, that our descendants, who long after we're gone, will still have. So there's that idea that I really like. There's also, I can recommend, I'll put it in the chat. There's an essay by Andrew Joyce called Envying the Cruel Falcon. And it's about Robinson Jeffers on the Occidental Observer. And there's just a lot of really great takes. There's a couple quotes from some like communist forums where they talk about how communism is essentially anti-ecological and it talks about how like the old Toryist and the fascist and National Socialist were big fans of the environment, and how it's kind of antithetical to Marxism. It's a really great piece to read. And there's also, if you get a chance to find any of the Jonathan Bowden lectures on Robinson Jeffers, it's called American Misanthrope, Robinson Jeffers by Bowden. And that's a really good lecture. And Robinson Jeffers was this anti-liberal, anti-egalitarian guy who was a poet and writer. He's also very concerned with the nature and kind of the nature of things. And he talks about man envying the cruel falcon because it doesn't. And it reminds me very much of like Nietzsche and the genealogy of morals and master morality and slave morality and rejecting egalitarianism. So yeah, that's kind of my quick rundown of reading list of things that I've either been into or into now that I definitely recommend. And I guess just in closing, for everything, I think there's definitely things we can do. There's the global public nuisance doctrine I'm working on. There's cutting aid to the world, closing immigration off, and these other projects that we should help fund, and we should advocate that our government, if they're going to use our tax money for these insane, ridiculous projects, that they should use them for these projects like the cloning the redwoods. And we should look towards these sort of interesting creative solutions. Also, like you talked about with the different types of engines. And I think holistically, if we get control of immigration, third world aid, not using American military for babysitting Israel, but for cleanup efforts. I'm hoping it's not too late and we can get a handle on this. I guess that's why we're doing it. I guess most of us involved in this movement to some degree think that this can be turned around and salvaged. And I think all that would be a decent start.
Yeah, I don't know. I have to operate on the idea that it could. Otherwise, I don't really know what else I would do. Is just create a bunker or something. But even if that's not possible, I think there's a huge advantage to informing people and getting our message out there. And then in regards to art, while we're on that topic, I wanted to say, that's kind of how you tell the difference between art and propaganda in a way. Is like art, you are hoping that this is something that will go on forever, and or that it potentially could. And so when I'm drawing my drawings or whatever, in the back of my mind somewhere, I have this idea that someone could be watching this 1,000 years from now. It's like, that's kind of the idea that I want to have. And the same thing for our books, our ideas when we're getting it out there. I think we can look towards the long term. Obviously, we do want to try to make an impact in the here and now, because we have to fight, otherwise there won't be a future in 1,000 years. So,
right,
it's a balancing act.
It is indeed.
But yeah, just to wrap up everything, I think that this idea, I call my show World of Scarcity, and so this is actually a perfect funnel into that, because waking people up to this idea that there is scarcity in the world, I think will lead them on a path to nationalism. A lot of people are just really comfortable right now. They haven't felt pain or anything in a long time, but these chickens will come home to roost. And in the meantime, I think that, like I said, if people are on the left, we can talk about climate change. If they're on the right, we can talk about declining standards of living and so on. Because, frankly, if we don't do something about this huge population growth in the third world and the growing affluence there, you're going to be left eating bugs in America. So nobody wants that.
Yeah, and they are experimenting with bug burgers to figure out how to feed.
I saw that.
The billion. The idea is if they keep packing people into America to bring them to freedom. We're all going to be in these high-rise favela semi-shanties and eating bug burgers, and with little pocket parks will be the only place with trees. And so if you don't want that world, if you want a more naturalist environment, you might be into blood and soil nationalism.
Hear, hear.
And you should be.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Richard.
Hey, I really appreciate you having me on and sharing with your audience. It's always, just kind of humbling to even be invited, honestly, to want to have a conversation with me and hear some of my thoughts. And it really means a lot. I wanted to thank you.
Yeah, I can tell you care a lot and have researched about this issue a lot. So couldn't think of a better person to talk about it with. I encourage people watching this to go share, go subscribe to Richard's Twitter. Anywhere else you want to direct them to?
I have really just you can kind of find I have articles at Countercurrents that are linked on my Twitter, and my books linked on my Twitter. So that's really the best place. And I'll have some things coming out soon. I have a big piece on environmentalism that talks about my theory of public nuisance, global public nuisance. I'm going to do a kind of my thoughts on factory farming, kind of arguments in favor of animal rights, and just a kind of a hard right take on some of these problems with solutions, and just kind of look out for some of this stuff, because I've done a lot of you know, talking about the problems and trying to raise awareness, because that's where you have to start. You know, people don't want to hear solutions if they think everything's fine. They think you're just crazy. And going forward, I'm kind of putting together more legal theories and solutions, and what kind of the legislation would look like, and reallocating resources to fix some of these things.
Yeah.
And, so just kind of be on the lookout for that.
The public nuisance, that's a perfect way. We talked about left and right. That's a perfect way to get libertarians on board, is to go into some of these property rights ideas. So
it is, because the whole thing is basically based in the old common law idea of your bundle of sticks within your property rights, and each stick, you know, some people think property rights is just like one thing, but within property rights there are many different, like, you know, within a piece of property there's the right of enjoyment, the right to exclude, the right to transfer, and the right to be free from interference is where the nuisance doctrine comes from. So there's several kind of rights you have on your property, and a lot of people, you know, that kind of are unaware of it. So it's an interesting theory all in itself, but then applying it to the global stage, I think might catch on and give some. You know, I've talked about using the Navy and the military to clean up some trash in different places, and to put some sanctions and pressure on countries like China and India. And people, I've gotten some pushback, and they say it's like imperialist and I'm infringing on their property right. But yeah. I think this will kind of open people's minds to see that this legal theory is hundreds of years old, and that, you know, and maybe China doesn't have a right to pollute to the point where they're polluting Tokyo and Seoul, is kind of the idea. That your rights end where someone else's begins, kind of the old saying that you hear, and this is sort of applying that to global pollution, and I think it's very novel, and hopefully it catches on. Yeah,
I mean, let's face it. Some of our guys at some point are going to be on the forefront, running for president, possibly running for other offices, local offices, and this is a good way to differentiate your platform. I mean, I think it could really appeal to people. So
yeah, that's true. There's going to be, and hopefully there's going to be, like you said, our people who are listening to these shows and watching these. You know, they might be. I know there's like a lot of people that follow me that are like still in high school or just entering college, and at some point they, like you said, they might be running for president, might be in Senate, and they're going to need it needs to be kind of an intellectual groundwork. And I think the kind of writing we do and like the videos you do, that is gives people an alternative. It's this other position that they're not getting in school in the mainstream, and it's real important to lay that groundwork, because we're in the early stages of all this, really still coming out of like the liberal democracy and kind of in a post-white America. It's still early, and it's good stuff. I'm glad everyone's out there working on it.
Yeah, well, if we're making the right people scared, I think we're onto something. So
yeah, that's true. You always like, what did Mussolini say? Like, so many enemies, so much honor. And saying, the more enemies and the bigger they are, the more honor you have, the more you're doing it.
That's right. You just give us fuel. All right. Well, I'll say goodbye then, and hope we can have you on again. Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks. I really appreciate it.
Take care.
See ya.
And thank you, everyone, for watching World of Scarcity. Apologize for the little hiccup there. For those of you who stuck with us through the whole thing, arigatou gozaimasu. And Yang 2020. See y'all.